And we'll give everyone a few minutes to connect and be able to hear. Great, thanks so much. Hello and welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are logging in from. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing series of webinars conducted jointly with other EU Horizon funded projects who are also working on irregular migration. These 7 projects are listed behind me. I will put links to their websites in the chat. My name is Stephanie Acker, and I'm a research associate at the Migration Policy Center and the Communications and Policy Coordinator for the Protecting Irregular Migrants in Europe, or PRIME project, and we are the host for today's joint webinar. As a housekeeping note, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our joint YouTube channel, where you can also view the other webinars in this series. I'd like to start by introducing our 3 speakers and discussant today, who are all part of the PRIME project in some ways. In some way, Claire Fox-Roos is a part-time assistant professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. Joachim Palme is a professor of political science in the Department of Government at Uppsala University. Martin Roos is a professor of migration studies and deputy director at the Migration Policy Center, which is part of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies here at the European University Institute. He is also the principal investigator for the PRIME project. We are also joined by Christiane Kapch, who is a senior specialist in migration policy at the International Labour Organization in Geneva and a member of PRIME's External Advisory Board. Today's webinar is based on a new research paper that was authored by Claire Fox-Roos, Joachim Palme, and Martin Roos, and this joint webinar will present a theoretical analysis of the role played by national institutions in shaping the lives and policies concerning irregular migrants in Europe. We'll first hear a presentation from Martin, and then remarks by our discussant Christiane, and then we'll aim to have 20 to 30 minutes of time designated to asking discussion questions to Claire, Joachim, and Martin. So as Martin is presenting or Christiane is presenting her remarks, please feel free to put your questions in the chat so that I can keep a log and we'll be able to have a really vibrant discussion. I'll now hand it over to Martin.
All right, well, thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see so many of you here. As Stephanie said, the paper that we're presenting today is meant to be a theoretical framework paper for our project on the conditions of irregular migrants in Europe. For those of you who've been involved with big international projects, I think it's always an open question whether or not it's a good idea to have an overarching theoretical framework, but we decided to have one. So the paper is published, you have the link, and it's meant to provide the basis for what we do, but it's also meant to end up as a freestanding academic article. So we very much appreciate that you're here, and we're looking forward to your feedback. I will, as Stephanie said, I'll speak for very briefly, hopefully for about 15-20 minutes, and then Christiane will come in with some initial remarks before we open it up. I'll attempt to share my screen. Okay, can you see that? Okay, good. So, as was mentioned, this paper is co-authored with Claire and Joachim, who are both here. Apologies, Joachim, I've misspelled your name. I just realized. So we'll all join the discussion afterwards. And this is part of the PRIME project, which is funded by Horizon Europe. And as most of you will be aware, this is a joint webinar series of different projects funded by the Commission to work on different aspects of irregular migration, irregular migrants. This is our consortium. There are 7 organizations. And really what we are trying to do is specifically focus on the role that national institutions play in shaping the conditions of experiences of migrants across Europe. We conduct a lot of empirical research with migrants, employers, policy actors, and the public across a number of European countries. And we try to come up with policy strategies that account for some of these competing priorities and that kind of recognize some of the institutional diversity that exists across European countries, but also across sectors, and the implications that might have for policies vis-à-vis irregular migrants. Now, we keep talking about institutions. So what we mean by that, in a kind of political science sense, is formal rules and policies that structure actors' behavior and interaction. So these are kind of formal rules that, as most of you will be very aware, are associated with particular values, normative principles that individual members of society might have. So a particular welfare state might be structured in a way that you have a lot of reciprocity built into a social protection system, for example. So it's a contribution-based system, for example, but in that country with that system, you're likely to also have a significant share of the population who think that reciprocity should be a guiding principle of welfare redistribution. So we focus on formal rules, but we also are conscious of the fact that these formal rules come with these informal societal attitudes. So we're focused particularly on 4 types of institutions: national legal systems, national political institutions, labor market regulations, and welfare state policies. And basically, we are trying to find out the role that these types of institutions play in shaping the conditions of irregular migrants across Europe. And we know, of course, that there's a lot of institutional diversity. So we suspect that this diversity in national legal systems, political systems, labor and welfare market institutions and welfare institutions will play a role in affecting migrants. So to come to the framework, again, I'll be brief on the kind of existing research. As many of you will know, there's a large body of research on irregular migration, irregular migrants, their conditions. But I would say that most of the research that looks at the experiences and conditions of irregular migrants focuses on the migration status per se, so irregular status or different types of irregular status, and maybe also on the characteristics, so gender, nationality, ethnicity. What role do these individual characteristics and what role does migration status per se play in making individuals vulnerable, for example? And when it comes to the host country side and kind of host country politics and policies, I think there's been quite a bit of research that looks at the role of actors in shaping policies vis-a-vis irregular migrants. And we basically think what's been missing, maybe not completely, but where we do need more research, is to look at how the conditions of irregular migrants are not only how they're shaped by individuals' characteristics and migration status, or by political parties, actors, but also by the institutional context, by the national institutional context. And for those of you who work on kind of comparative institutional analysis, you will again know that there's been a lot of research on how different national institutions affect the lives of citizens. And there's also been some work on how they affect migrants, regular migrants, but not much research on what those institutions might mean for irregular migrants. And this is basically what we are trying to do. We look at how institutions might matter both directly and indirectly, and I'll explain that in a second, what we mean by the indirect effects, which actually we focus on in our analysis because we think they are particularly important. So the starting point really of the kind of the paper is that European countries, well, all high-income countries, but all countries, but we focus on Europe, face a fundamental dilemma when they develop policies vis-a-vis irregular migrant, and there's a goal conflict between, on the one hand, immigration controls, and on the other hand, protecting fundamental rights of all people on the territory. So our kind of starting premise is that all government policy responses need to somehow address and manage this conflict, this tension, in one way or another. So immigration controls and fundamental rights protections conflict at both at the level of values, but also at the level of interests. So the right and goal to control immigration stems directly from the nature of the nation state and its underlying values of democratic self-determination and the rule of law. But it can also obviously be sustained by particular interests, so by perceived effects of irregular immigration or migration on the host country. At the same time, the goal of protecting the fundamental rights of all people on the state's territory can be grounded in human rights, obviously, but also in universal understandings of the values of freedom, dignity, equality, and rule of law. So the values of a country can, of course, be interpreted in a universal way, at least to an extent. So those values ground some rights protections. So the argument is that whatever policy you're talking about, whether it's a regularization policy, whether it's a policy to give legal rights to irregular migrant workers, or you have a firewall, all policies vis-a-vis regular migrants need to somehow face this goal conflict. And at times, obviously, in recent years and decades, in recent years in particular, we've seen a lot of emphasis on immigration control at the expense of some of the kind of rights and conditions of irregular migrants. But of course, one could also have, for particular aspects of this issue, you could also have some people putting emphasis on more fundamental rights protection. So I think there needs to be a balance, or there needs to be some addressing of this tension, and how this is done, how this goal conflict is managed, has very important consequences for the conditions of irregular migrants. So that's in a way the starting point. And so what the paper then tries to do is to provide a theoretical framework for how and why institutions play a role, institutions and the interests with which they're associated with play a role in influencing the management of this goal conflict, and thus also the conditions of irregular migrants. And so the basically broad argument, I'm not going through it in detail of the paper, just giving you the kind of outline, is that the settings of these key national institutions can basically weigh in by favoring different sides of the conflict. So some types of institutions tend to strengthen the fundamental rights protections side of the conflict, whereas others tend to facilitate more immigration control, where some other institutions, again, might encourage a kind of more of a balance between the two. And as we describe in detail in the paper, institutions can have this effect in kind of three different ways. We argue they can constrain national policy actors and responses to irregular migrants. So, for example, a particular government might want to restrict a particular right of an irregular migrant, but there might be constitutional reasons why this is not possible to do, at least in the short run. But institutions can also shape the interests and distribution of power among the different actors. So the distribution of power between employer associations and trade unions, but also of political parties. And that might also have an effect. And institutions act as a resource that might then influence, so the different types of welfare states might have different capacities to deal with migration. And again, this webinar is too short to go through some of this conceptualization in great detail, but basically, at the risk of drawing a chart that has too many arrows, of course, everything is connected with everything, but what we're trying to say here is that what we're trying to understand is the conditions of irregular migrants in box E on the right. And the key independent variable that we're interested in is the role of national institutions in shaping these conditions. And we say they can do that directly if, for example, there is a certain constitutional protection that basically applies to everybody on the territory, regardless of migration status. That will obviously have a direct effect. But there's also an indirect effect via the national policy responses to irregular migrants. So national institutions shape the politics and policy making vis-a-vis irregular migrants. This is a mediating variable. And we think that this is particularly important and has been neglected a little bit in some of these debates. So that's what our paper focuses on a lot. We don't say that everything is predetermined through institutions. There's obviously actors, institutional and political actors who develop their preferences and within that institutional framework. And there's also private actors. That might be individual employers, or it might be the public, citizens, and it might also be migrants themselves. And as you can see here, as I mentioned before, we believe that these national institutions, legal, political, labor, and welfare, they're associated with particular types of values that underlie the institutional configurations, and this varies across countries. So we are trying in this paper to basically explain why institutions might matter, understand what are the key variations, and develop some hypotheses that might be helpful. And in the interest of time, I'm just gonna run very briefly now through the variations that we think are particularly important, that might matter for influencing the goal conflict, but then also the conditions of irregular migrants. So remember, we said legal, political, welfare, and labor market institutions. So we need to decide, obviously, which variations, which aspects of these institutions are particularly important, and why. And so in legal institutions, that the paper explains, we particularly look at the nature and scope of de jure fundamental rights protections. So whether or not the Constitution uses universal language in describing some rights protections. So for example, does the Constitution say that everybody in the country has a right to health care? Might matter or will matter for whether or not irregular migrants have that right. The scope of judicial powers to enforce rights obviously matters, and that varies across countries as well. As well as the effects of competing laws. So the extent to which rights are protected in not vis-à-vis the state, but vis-à-vis private individuals. So for example, vis-à-vis employers. So in some countries, for example, there might be some competing laws. In common law countries, there might be an illegality, or there is an illegality doctrine that suggests that some employment rights might not be enforceable, or might not be valid if there's no employment contract. An employment contract is basically null and void if the relationship is not legal in the first place. So that matters in terms of the variations. And the variations in political institutions that we think matter are essentially to do with things that decide whether or not marginal groups have a voice in the decision-making processes and in political processes. So whether or not you have proportional representation or a majoritarian electoral system will depend to what extent some of these competing effects will be balanced or not. The same thing applies for involvement of social partnership and the existence of procedural veto points. Again, so we develop hypotheses around all of these factors. So to what extent do different types of electoral systems, different types of mechanisms for including social partnership, what does that mean? What does that likely mean for the politics around the issue and for conditions for irregular migrants? In the labor market, briefly, there's been quite a bit of research on the role of employment protections. So the degree of labor market flexibility will influence the scale of your low-wage labor market, which in turn will likely influence the employer demand for low-waged migrant workers, which may then also have consequences for irregular migrant labor. The way your care sector is organized, whether or not it's chronically dependent on low-cost labor or not, will have an impact again on employer demand for migrant labor and also irregular workers. To what extent you think that certain sectors are of strategic importance, as we have seen through COVID, you could hypothesize that there might be more political room for maneuver, for example, regularization programs in sectors that are considered to be important. So irregular migrants working in what are supposed to be strategically important sectors may be given better treatment as a hypothesis. This might matter. And finally, in terms of the welfare institutions, again, it might be the case, as some research has found when it comes to the consequences for legal migration and the rights of legal migrants and public attitudes to legal migrants, it might be the case that there's less pressure to restrict welfare rights of irregular migrants or irregular migrants' access to welfare in countries that have welfare systems grounded in reciprocity, because where even irregular migrants are seen as making some sort of contribution, at least through their employment, for example. So that might mean there's less pressure to restrict some of their welfare rights. Arguably, in universalism, universal welfare system might foster solidarity also with those working outside immigration laws. And we think that the systems or welfare programs that emphasize kind of means testing might be most exposed to this goal conflict. And it's there where actually there might be a lot of pressure to restrict rights. So just to conclude very briefly, again, I've gone through this very quickly. It's a very long paper. We need to cut it into half for the purpose of a journal article, but we've basically been trying to provide a theoretical framework that enables people to, first of all, understand why institutions might matter, and then also how institutional variations, legal, political, welfare, and labor might matter for the management of goal conflicts and also for conditions. And we have made this distinction between direct and indirect effects. So we end up with kind of a table of a lot of hypotheses. And then, of course, then the question is, well, how are you going to do this in practice? And again, the paper was written in an open-minded way, in the sense that there might then be different methodological approaches to how you study some of these institutional variations. Obviously, one way would be to study all variations at the same time, where you have these different institutional configurations. That is bound to be very exploratory then, because a lot of things are different. Or you could just focus on one particular type of variation, say in the legal institutions, keep everything else constant, and adopt a design that enables the comparative analysis in that way. So we are right now doing empirical analysis on the legal rights that irregular migrants have in all European countries, on employer demand for irregular migrant workers and other regular migrant and other workers, the interests and policy preferences of key actors, and also what the public thinks. So we're gonna basically do comparative analysis and European countries with different institutional contexts to see what, if any, effects these institutions have on all these things that are listed here. Okay, I said I'd be brief. I wasn't as brief as I wanted to be, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I will now turn it over to Christiane for your reflections as our discussant. And as a reminder, if you have questions already for Martin's paper based on what Christiane shares, please start writing your questions in the chat.
All right, thank you very much for having me. And first of all, let me congratulate all three authors for a very well-written and argued paper. You've done a real great job in systematizing possible areas of convergence and key institutional variations among European states, and therefore entry points for comparison. And because I find your expose so very convincing, all I can try to do today is make a few points that risk bringing further complexity in the analysis, as though this wasn't complex enough. Or in other words, I actually have really nothing to criticize, but in reading the paper, a few additional questions popped up in my mind. And of course, in light of where I come from, many of my remarks will be linked to labor market issues. And so I start with my point number one. We know from certain empirical studies that there is this strong link between irregular migration and the labor market in destination countries. For example, if you look at data from the Pew Hispanic Center from the period 2008-9, after the financial and economic crisis, that data pointed to much less irregular migration into the US than in normal times. And similarly, during this period, Frontex reported much lower numbers of people attempting to reach Europe via the Mediterranean. So we know that people tend to come where the work is, which is, by the way, also defeating the so-called welfare tourism thesis at the same time. So now, with this strong link between irregular migration and the labor market, I wonder, don't European countries all have a labor market-related goal that is somewhat at the intersection of the goal conflict between immigration control and fundamental rights? Namely, not to increase irregular migration, because irregular migration tends to create a downward spiral of working conditions. And this goal is linked to both values and interests, of which you speak in the paper. Equality among all workers as a value, and a level playing field as an interest. And by the way, I would say a level playing field will not only be in the interest of trade unions, but also in the interest of law-abiding employers. Seasonal agricultural migration during COVID would be a good example here, where employers who went by the strict sanitary rules imposed by certain governments suffered a lot from unfair competition by peers. So there's also, you know, on both sides of the social partners, there is an interest there in not having a more irregular migration that brings down working conditions. And this intersection between immigration control and fundamental rights brings me to another crossroad in my second point, namely the crossroad of irregularity in immigration status and irregularity in employment. Your paper takes irregularity in immigration status as the starting point, but it seems to me that in Europe, a lot of gray zones are created by the overlap with irregular employment. And indeed, the paper very rightly points to varying degrees of institutional tolerance for the black market or informal employment. And well, of course, migrants in irregular immigration situations can work both in the formal and in the informal economy. An example of an irregular migration status and formal employment is the following. The migrant worker has no valid residence permit, but works in a formal enterprise, which has him or her in their official books. And this would be the case, for instance, of an overstayer. While an example of irregular migration status and informal employment would be this: the migrant worker crosses the border through irregular channels, works in a formal enterprise, but is not declared by that enterprise. And then again, to make things even more complicated, you can also have irregularity created when a migrant enjoys a regular immigration status, but works in the informal economy. And the example here would be, for instance, a migrant worker has valid residence and work permits, but works in a non-registered enterprise. So because of all these gray zones and the difficulties in capturing the various forms of irregularity, I think it will be very important in the empirical part of the research to be very clear about how irregularity is defined, or what forms of irregularity are considered or not considered, sort of to also include this issue of irregular employment. And by the way, the regular immigration status in my last example can also stem from free movement provisions under regional integration schemes, which leads me to my next integration. When doing the empirical country level analysis, there will be a further overlapping issue, namely that of mobile people, that is to say, EU internal migrants who move into irregular segments of the labor market. And absolutely, I have zero answer to this, only a question to you all, which came to my mind. Will the goal conflict between immigration control and fundamental rights be more likely resolved in favor of immigration control in states where, on top of third nationals in irregular situation, you have a whole lot of intra-EU mobility into irregular employment, sort of that as an additional complexity factor? I would say populists will tend to not make a difference at all between freedom of movement and the migration of third country nationals. On the contrary, there will be, I suppose, what Paul Gilroy called or coined as calculated ambiguity between all of these groups, which will help to create the image of being overrun by migrants. And related to this, of course, is also the point that liberal democracy have decided to grant asylum to people coming from conflict zones, and that the numbers of this type of migration can in principle not be controlled. And your paper alludes to this. So I see this as a huge dilemma for many European states at this juncture in history, this business that you cannot control that part of the migration influx at all. But let me move to another point. In different places of the paper, the issue is raised of migration policy versus social policy and or employment policy. And the question is asked, in what settings does immigration law trump labor law? And this is a key question for the ILO, of course. And ILO Convention 143 of 1975 answers this question in favor of labor law. There's no question about it. Article 9 of that convention makes it very clear that irregularity does not strip migrant workers of all rights. In particular, migrants should enjoy the rights arising out of past employment as regards remuneration, social security, and any other benefits. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So shipping someone out without being paid their dues on grounds of their irregular immigration status is a total no-go under this convention. And actually, even in case of a dispute arising over these issues, workers are granted the right to present their case to a competent body. And while irregular migrants are not free from the risk, of course, of being expelled eventually, ILO case law makes it very clear that when someone files a complaint, even an irregular worker, that person must be granted the right to stay in the country long enough to go through with their case. So there are 12 European countries that have ratified that conventions, and for these, these are binding obligations, which clearly also limit what states can do. In that same context, it's also worth noting that migrant workers in irregular situations also enjoy fundamental rights as set out in other ILO conventions that cover issues other than migration, and especially the rights as they are defined under the 1998 ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, which apply to all migrants, including migrants in irregular situations. And these rights concern freedom of association and collective bargaining, the elimination of child labor and forced labor, non-discrimination, and since 2022, occupational safety and health issues as well. And as I think I'm running out of time and of voice, here comes my final and very personal point. In the conclusion, precisely as you've presented it, you wonder about methodology for the empirical analysis. I would clearly favor the more challenging and exploratory institutional configurations exposed over, for example, a most similar cases design, because I really fully buy into your argument of feedbacks and of interdependency effects between the different sets of institutions. And I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiane. So Claire, Joachim, and Martin, if you want to respond to anything just initially from what Christiane shared, she had many points, so you can pick what you might want to respond to. And then if you have a question, if you could write your question in the chat, there are just a lot of us on the call, so the chat will help us be able to moderate those. So please put your questions in the chat, and Claire, Joachim, and Martin, I'll hand it over to you to respond.
Yeah, sorry. So thanks so much, Christiane. This is really very helpful and very will help us a lot going forward. I think we probably won't respond to everything now, but maybe just briefly. I'll respond on one thing, which on how to define irregular status. Now, of course, the challenge that any project has, such as this one, is that, as you rightly say, is that there might be a lot of variations, not only across institutional contexts, but also as I said, kind of people with different individual characteristics, but also with different types of migration status. And kind of as we have a pretty clear kind of the extreme definition of, in our sense, of irregular means people without irregular resident status, which therefore also means but I'll come back to the other point, is that means that you don't have the legal right to work. But then I think there's a lot of people who have regular status but are working in violations of conditions attached to their status. That could be like semi-legal or semi-compliant, a lot of research. And I think it's important to, as you say, to consider how these different types of workers then compare. Also, as you said, EU mobile citizens might in some ways fall into some sort of irregularity. So what we do, basically what we do is we say you can't study the conditions of irregular migrants if you also compare them to the conditions of other migrants, including regular migrants, because it might not be status that does the job, it might be something else. So we just try to aim at getting a mix of people. Maybe we're not covering all the categories that you mentioned, but I think it's an important point. Okay, maybe Claire and Joachim want to respond to some of the other comments.
Thanks so much, Christiana. I find those comments very helpful. So thanks for giving the time and thinking through the issues, also bringing your perspective from the ILO. I think, again, many things to consider. As Martin mentioned, the definition of irregular migration has been critical for us, not just in writing this paper, but in actually the empirical work around measuring rights that we're doing at the moment in 28 European countries, including the UK. And yes, this has been really important at the empirical level, because, as you know, rights vary so much across categories of, whether somebody is irregular as a worker or irregular in status. So as Martin said, we have focused primarily on those who have come irregularly and then also are working irregularly. And actually, part of our work has been to look and compare the rights of that particular group of irregular migrants with other groups. So one thing that we look at is about equal, the degree to which migrants are treated equally or not, and equal to citizens and equal to permanent, those who are in the country lawfully, perhaps working illegally. So, it's certainly an important issue. We've come across examples, of course, where even those who are working irregularly have rights that those who are in the country illegally do not have, rights to things like compensation for accidents and injuries at work. And I think that will form an important part of our analysis, why it is that institutional configurations affect those differences. And that's an important part of the analysis. Also, as you mentioned, talked about the constraint of ILO conventions. Certainly that is something that we look at, and it's interesting to see the extent to which member states who have signed up to the ILO conventions actually see these as constraints in practice, and how those constraints are weighed against other institutional factors. So as you know, those countries that have common law systems really struggle with this, because even within the court system themselves, judges are internally divided often on the relevant priority of common law versus commitments to both national principles and international human rights standards. So, thank you for raising those, because these are issues that we want to understand better, to understand the nature of the different constraints. I'll pass to Joachim now. Thank you.
I also wanted to thank Christine for her thoughtful comments, and there's certainly more things that we need to look at, but I think some advice you gave, we can make good use of that. I just wanted to pick up your point about what different actors say that they dislike when it comes to irregular migrants. This may be the case. And I think maybe there's an increased awareness of the consequences of irregular migration, but it's still the case that we organize our social policies and our labor markets in ways that sort of, in a way, nurture or provide very fertile ground for exploitation of irregular migrants, and I think that our attempt here is to take this broader grip to look at these different kinds of policies, and this is I think in line with your emphasis on looking at the configurations that to look at the interplay of different policies. And then, I mean, as also Martin said, we're interested in not only the different interests here, but also how the principles play a role. And maybe that is also a way of sort of approaching this as a goal conflict, but it may also matter in how we seek to control and how we seek to defend rights, so that the balance is not a zero-sum game. You can actually achieve worse or better balances. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll go to a couple questions. I'll share 2 questions and then you guys can decide how to respond. So the first is from Raffaele, who wants to know that about multi-level governance and subnational authorities, especially in decentralized systems. Subnational authorities have significant autonomy in crafting their own agenda on undocumented migration. Besides their formal powers, they also have benefits from policy ambiguities that authority dispersal introduces, sometimes resulting in divergent, if not conflicting policies. And so what are you planning to incorporate, or if you are planning to incorporate multi-level governance perspective into your study, how you'll take that into account? The next question is from Luca, who wants to know the impact of European architecture for the convergence of migration policies and welfare and employment policies in defining kind of a new equilibrium between liberal and democratic dilemmas, possibly looking at the UK and Switzerland as examples that are not constrained by the EU and how they've managed those.
Maybe make a brief start and then Joachim and Claire can come in. No, thanks for this. So on the multi-level question, of course, Rafael, I think that's right, and there's been a lot of work around this. But Prime basically focuses not exclusively, but puts a heavy emphasis on national laws and regulations, because we think that national laws and regulations are very important. That doesn't mean that, as you say, that quite a few things are happening at the subnational level, but perhaps, I mean, that's my own opinion now. In recent years, there's been an awful lot of work on the subnational, and I think we want to kind of put a light again on the importance of national policy making in framing also what happens at the subnational level. So in a way, some of the institutions that we're interested in and some of the institutional variations operate at the national level. But maybe Joachim and Claire want to add to that in terms of what a few things we do at the subnational level. And I'll let Joachim or Claire deal with the European architecture. I mean, we basically think there's institutional variations, but maybe Joachim or Claire, you want to come in here?
Okay, maybe I'll begin. Yes, in terms of the subnational level, as Martin said, our focus is on the national, but we do pick up elements. We're aware of the variation, and we have a research strand that looks at rights in practice, where there is scope to look at variation at the sort of local discretionary level, as well as regional level, municipal level, depending on the particular country and how things are administered. But it is something that we note as well through our research. So whilst it might not be our focus, it's something that we're picking up as we're doing the empirical work and the data comparisons. And then we have some countries where there's quite large variation even within the country. So on things like welfare, and say example like the UK, where you've got devolved regions which have got some devolved powers, and they actually in some senses are at a national level, although not at the UK wide level. Those types of variations we pick up, and they're relevant to our scoring when we're creating our index of rights at the moment. So it's an important point and something that we're very conscious of, but trying to do it through this lens of national. The other point, Switzerland is not a country that we look at, so I can't comment on that particular comparison. And certainly we look at the importance of EU institutions and EU norms and frameworks and values as part of understanding the liberal framework that you mentioned. And certainly values within countries are an important point of differentiation as we see it, and important in terms of affecting interests. Maybe Joachim, you can add a little more on this. Yeah.
Just briefly, I think this is right. We do first, have a focus on national policies, and I think this has to do with our rights-based approach. It's difficult to look at the regional variation in the same way. So that, it's in a way a limitation, but can hopefully provide a framework for more detailed regional analysis by others. Still, we try to capture this both in terms of our scoring and in terms of the interviews that we do. So we hope to cast at least some new light on this in a systematic fashion, but there certainly will be more things to do if you're really interested in the conditions of migrants. So, we will not answer all questions.
Thank you. We'll go to two other questions. So one wants to focus on what is the role of social networks for irregular migrants, and does that play more of a role in facilitating access to certain things like the labor market, like education or other institutions? So will you look at that, or how are you thinking about the role of networks and the conditions of irregular migrants? And I think this question comes up in most webinars, but is important for us to talk about, is also how are you distinguishing between regular and irregular migrants, since that's so much part of the kind of ideological construction. That question is from El Bojadini Yassin. So if you could talk maybe about both those things definitionally, and then how you'll kind of look at that when you do your analysis, and then also if and how social networks will be a part of what you look at, and how that maybe influences institutions.
Sorry, we didn't coordinate the order.
Yeah.
Joachim, go ahead.
On the social networks, I think this is what we try to capture, both with the interviews with the irregular migrants themselves, but also in that we try to capture, not only loose social networks, but what civil society does. So this is why we're interested in how these irregular migrants actually get access to the services that they need. And of course, here we're interested in what kind of resources they can access in terms of networks as well. So we have for sure an interest in that aspect. I'll leave the definition to someone else.
Maybe if I could add a little bit more on the social network side also, sort of two aspects to it. One, we have a project that looks specifically at interests and high interest configurations within our different European what we call institutional focus countries, how they impact on outcomes for migrants. So social networks will be an important part of that, because as we've explained in our paper, there are certain structures within particular governments that facilitate to different degrees the involvement in policy making of different members of the voluntary sector. We have different models of social partnership across the countries that we're looking at, and that's something that's important to capture. And I think also we're conscious of the fact that a lot of organizations are doing a great deal of work for migrants on the ground at a voluntary level. And we want to distinguish that from the work that the state is doing, and not to conflate the two things, because I think it's very important whether somebody has access to a right vis-a-vis the state, a right that can be enforced at a legal level, and then a service that can actually, they may get in practice, but it's charitable donation. It's not necessarily part of the state infrastructure. So these things are important to capture, but also to distinguish when we're measuring the rights of irregular migrants. And perhaps, Martin, you can speak about the definition. I think we've spoken a little about it already, but it might be helpful to clarify that.
Yes, I I think regardless of how one thinks about irregular migrants kind of normatively, I think the starting point is that you know, not having some sort of regular status is likely to have consequences, and this is why we are studying this issue. So I think it's an important point that some of these things are always to a degree constructed, but then they're also real because they have real effects for individuals. And there's migration is obviously a highly salient issue. Irregular migration is one of the most politicized issues in Europe right now. And there's a lot of policy making around specifically irregular migrants. So I think finding out how migrants without regular status negotiate some of the situations they find themselves in, how they negotiate, how they navigate in different institutional contexts is very important. So I think there are some material consequences and some real consequences to not having status, and this is why it's one of the reasons why it's important to study it.
Christiane, go ahead.
Yes, to just add on that, in terms of our ILO thinking, we always make the point that it's important both for informal employment and for irregular status to become more formalized, to protect people. Sort of there's really the protection aspects that are very often attached to the status of the person. I agree, of course, already given what I explained about, you know, you can be in formal employment and still have somehow be labeled irregular and blah blah blah. So there is this recognition, I would say, but from our perspective, it's always very important that you move from an informal to a more formal status, both in employment and immigration, for better protection.
Thank you to all of you. I'll close with the one final question. This is maybe jumping ahead and unfair to ask researchers before they've conducted the research, but in your focus, this goes back a bit to kind of levels of governance, but do you have a sense of if the focus is on national policy, how will you, or national institutions, what do you think that will mean for EU-wide policy as a whole? If we're focusing on Europe, but the focus is on national institutions, how do you see that interplay between the role of national institutions and broader EU policy?
I think for us, part of this is understanding the constraints that national institutions are subject to in order to understand what is feasible, what, at one level, what's politically desirable, what should we be aiming for, and what is feasible, and what are the steps towards achieving our ideals as well. And I think better awareness of national conditions, national values, national constraints is kind of critical to understanding what we can do together as nations and together at the level of the EU, and gives us a better sense of the steps that we need on the path towards that ideal goal. So hopefully this is an important contribution. That's the way I would see it, yeah.
Joachim, do you want to?
I want to agree with that. It was very well expressed, and I think that this configurational approach that we are talking about is I mean, a remedy to the ideas that we can have sort of one-size-fits-all solutions. So creating the awareness and seeing the constraints, but also showing hopefully that you can actually make a difference by designing policies as well. Even if you don't have to do it in this exactly the same way across Europe.
Okay, I have nothing to add to that, Stephanie. So. You're on mute, Stephanie.
I am. I'm talking. Thank you so much. So Martin, just to conclude, I wonder if you might be able to give a sense of some of the next key things that Prime is focusing on coming up, and then I'll close with a few overarching announcements.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, as I said at the beginning, we've spent some time trying to develop this kind of theoretical grounding. Prime is a very integrated project, which has many benefits, I think, but also comes with challenges. So we do a lot of comparative analysis, which requires us to move data across borders, and that so it's been quite demanding from a kind of ethical and data protection point of view. But we now have just started field work, and so basically, as I said, what we're doing now is study. So we do interviews with migrants in different European countries that are characterized by different institutional contexts. We're surveying and interviewing employers. We're going to interview key policy actors, and we're going to do surveys of the public in these different countries, precisely to see how institutions matter. We're also doing surveys of migrants, recently arrived migrants in what we call the mobility countries. So these are kind of first countries of arrivals in the EU to study migrants' intra-EU mobility intentions and behavior. So we now kind of just begun the field work. But the I should mention our first two kind of big deliverables is the one that's been mentioned by both Claire and Joachim. Sometime later this year, we will publish a study that looks at the legal rights of irregular migrants in all EU member states, to do a comparative study based on the framework that we've developed. So that's a lot of work that's happening right now. And then so that work is kind of led by Claire and Joachim and colleagues at Uppsala. And then a separate study that Joachim and I involved in looks at what we call public policy preferences, where we basically ask how does the public, how do citizens think about policies vis-a-vis regular migrants? And again, our starting question is, do these attitudes and policy preferences that citizens hold, are they in any way related to the institutional context? So do people in countries with different institutional contexts think about these things differently? And what might that mean for policy making of various kinds? So that's where we're at the moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our speakers and to Christiane for joining. Thank you also for publishing this paper. To everyone who has not seen it, was linked in the meeting notes. We will send out a link to the recording when it's ready, and we'll also reshare the technical report that this paper was based on, this webinar was based on. I wanted to make two just final announcements. If you are interested in learning more about the PRIME project and would like to learn when we have new research coming out or other webinars, the best way to do that is to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website. I'll put that in the chat. And then please save the date for the next webinar in this series, which is April 22nd at the same time from 1 to 2. And that will be on measuring irregular migration. What do we know now? 15 years since the Clandestino project, which if you have studied irregular migration, you will know that this was a kind of very first major project in Europe, really proposing ways of measuring that. So April 26th from 1 to 2, I'll put that link in the chat right now, along with our webinar. Thank you everyone for coming. It was great to see so many people interested in this, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. And we will again send out a link of the recording once it's ready. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.